Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer. Today, we discuss medical ethics. We'll focus on the debate about the criteria for brain death. Our special guest is John Camillo, PhD and BeL. And an explanation of that might emerge as we continue. At any rate, he is an ethicist and the Personal Consultations Director at the National Catholic Bioethics Center. He manages its 24/7, oh my gosh, it's 24/7 free ethics consultation service, as well as the Personal Consultations Fellows and Interns program. What does he do? He applies Catholic moral theology to science and medicine through research, writing, speaking, and fielding hundreds of ethics questions every year. His areas of concentration include cooperation with evil, sexual orientation and gender identity, reproductive technologies, and pregnancy consultation. We have a lot ahead of us, so let's, as we always do, begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, to start, what is Catholics United on Brain Death and Organ Donation? What's that all about, and what were the goals of writing it and seeking endorsements for it?
So Catholics United on Brain Death and Organ Donation is a document that I co-authored with Dr. Joseph Ebley and Dr. Pete Colosi. And I wish to thank each of them very much for the wonderful collaboration we had in putting this together. And essentially what it is our effort to bring together Catholics who have been perhaps on opposing sides of the issue of brain death for many years, and in order to recognize the practical reality. So apart from longstanding principled debates about whether the notion of whole brain death may be consistent with Catholic moral teaching, and again, that's a debated issue, apart from those debates, the situation we have right now, this document aims to show, is not consistent even with what those who support brain death say that it must be. So we're basically saying, hey, some people say brain death is totally wrong. Some people say brain death is actually fine as a concept, but it has to be a certain type of brain death, which is called whole brain death, so a cessation of all function of the entire brain. And we're saying, guess what? What we have right now, the actual criteria that are being used in clinical practice do not even establish whole brain death. So we wanted to be able to, again, bring people together to recognize that whatever you think about the concept of brain death, the practical reality on the ground, the way this is being diagnosed, the protocols that exist, the guidelines that exist for doing it, are systematically failing even to establish what is called whole brain death. And so that is the impetus behind this, and we sought to seek endorsements for it precisely so that we could have help people to understand, if they've heard anything about this issue or been aware of it, help people to understand that this is not just a tiny minority of people who think that there are problems with brain death, but rather we've got a large group. We have 151 endorsers, almost all of them individuals, but we had one professional association, the National Association of Catholic Nurses, that signed on to our document, a couple of clergy, bishops. We had a number of healthcare professionals, philosophers, scientists, pro-life advocates. So, and they're from all over, primarily the United States, more than half the United States, but also from all over the world. We got people from Italy, the United Kingdom, Germany, Poland, and a few other places. So the idea is to say, hey, let's all come together again and recognize that in practice, at a minimum, regardless of what we think about the concept of brain death, in practice, this is clearly insufficient, what's going on, to make sure that people are truly dead.
And you let philosophers sign?
Yeah, I had to make a special exception, but only because one of our co-authors is a philosopher, Dr. Colosi.
All right. Mario.
I just have a quick question and then a longer question. Why, you just said that just a couple of bishops sign up that declaration? Why
Yes.
does we have more than 300 bishops in the United States? Why so few?
Sure, that is a great question. And of course, I can't speak for all the bishops. I will say we didn't systematically contact every single bishop out there. We contacted a number of bishops through various channels, mostly through personal contacts or connections we may have already had. So again, it wasn't a systematic process of going through absolutely everyone. And so many of them, I will say, they're very busy people. They may not have understood what was going on in this document. Others of them may have reviewed and they may have prayerfully considered it and decided either they agreed with it but didn't want to put their names on it for prudential reasons, or some may have disagreed with it. So, but as I said, I can't speak to and I won't speak to the reasons that each individual bishop gave us, because I think that's something that is certainly their prerogative to decide what they think is best.
I like what you expressed, prudential reasons. I don't.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, we philosophers, we don't have prudential
That's
reasons.
right. That's right.
Okay.
Well, if I could, I'll just add one thing, which is I alluded to the fact that there's a debate on this, right? A long-standing debate in Catholic circles over the concept of brain death. And so I think it's certainly fair to say that anyone could imagine, given the intense debate that there has been on this issue, and given that this particular document was coming from a group of just 3 individuals, humble individuals putting this document together. I wasn't doing this document, for example. This is not an official statement of the National Catholic Bioethics Center, for whom I work. Although recently the NCBC put out another statement on this issue that we can come back to later. But I will say that the point is, as a bishop, I can imagine bishops wanting to consider, do I want to put my name on this document, even if I agree with the content, on an issue where there's been intense debate and there continues to be intense division over the issue of brain death generally. It may have been, again, within their prudential judgment to say, hey, at this time, I don't yet want to commit to any particular position on this issue. And so they may have, in that light, chosen not to sign on.
Good. I have a question here. Why is there no moral certainty of death when following the American Academy of Neurology guidelines?
Yes. So essentially because the American Academy of Neurology guidelines systematically exclude any kind of need for confirmation that neuroendocrine function has stopped, in particular hypothalamic function. The hypothalamus is a part of the brain, and it is, systematically excluded. And there's now evidence which indicates over the past 10 years in particular, there's been confirmation that in at least half of patients declared brain dead, and perhaps many more, some indications as many as 4 out of 5 people declared brain dead, actually still have hypothalamic function, despite the application of the American Academy of Neurology guidelines. So when they're rigorously followed, you still have large numbers of patients being declared brain dead who continue to have a functioning hypothalamus, which is part of the brain.
So there is an ongoing hypothalamus function. So and you are saying that is incompatible or compatible with brain death, right? How you explain that?
Right. Yeah, no, I would say that if we're talking about whole brain death,
Right,
which is the notion of complete cessation of all function of the entire brain,
right,
I think it's fairly evident to say that if the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, continues to function,
right.
then the person is not whole
Dead.
brain dead,
Okay,
right? And so whole brain death has not occurred because hypothalamus is still functioning, which is part of the brain. And if whole brain death has not actually occurred, then we cannot declare a person dead. We must assume they're still alive.
perfect. Thank you.
Valerie,
Yes, as I was reading, I found myself wondering, what is hypothalamic function? Like what's going on when that's happening, when it's still functioning, and what would be the effect if, we did improve clinical guidelines and actually require the cessation of that function? What would the effect of that be,
Yeah, great question. So in essence, the hypothalamus is considered to be a sort of coordinator of various functions in the body. In other words, it is involved with coordinating the sex drive. It can be involved in coordinating the salt-water balance in the body, the sleep and sleep cycles. There are a number of functions that essentially are coordinated in some way through the hypothalamus, and it's involved with also processes such as puberty, for example. So hypothalamic function is particularly significant as far as that connection between the brain and hormones and hormonal cycles. And so if the hypothalamus is still functioning, and this is actually one of the ways that they figured out, or that we can say for sure that the hypothalamus is still functioning, one of the typical indicators of the cessation of hypothalamic function is a condition called diabetes insipidus, because of the issues of no longer functioning hypothalamus. You're going to end up with diabetes insipidus in the patient. But precisely because many patients diagnosed brain dead do not have diabetes insipidus, this is a clear indicator that the hypothalamus is still working. Now, what would be the implications if we were to actually start testing for hypothalamic function and saying, no, we must have evidence that the hypothalamus has ceased functioning? Well, one major implication is that, a large number of people currently declared brain dead would still be considered alive, right? Like, again, from anywhere from 50% up to 84%. So we're talking about, again, as many as 4 out of 5 brain dead patients perhaps would no longer be considered dead. They'd actually be considered alive. And that has serious ramifications, particularly with regard to the organ donation question, because about 70% of donors who give their organs after a declaration of death have been declared dead using brain death criteria. So 70% declared dead using brain death criteria. Well, if anywhere from half to as much as 4 out of 5 of those declared brain dead are actually still alive, you're going to have a drastic cut in the number of organs also that are available for transplant, given that usually from a single brain dead donor, you would harvest multiple organs, vital organs, kidneys, lungs, etc.
So may I interject something? So you're saying that person is still alive so that they can harvest the organs as it is today?
Right. What I'm saying is that right now, based on the evidence that we have, and the notion of whole brain death as complete and irreversible cessation, what we have right now is that more than, let's say a majority of people who are declared brain dead before removing their vital organs are actually still alive. And so we're effectively removing vital organs, which is killing the patient who is still alive, in a majority of cases of organ donation. So that is the current reality based on the information we have right now. Again, and I would say this is only considering hypothalamic function, right? So because our statement was intended to try to bring unity, when we're talking about the limits and the problems with the current practice of brain death, we hyper-focused on just one question, which was hypothalamic function, because it's so clear and so obvious. All right, and we figured this is the one thing everybody should be able to see and agree is actually a problem right now. There are other issues with the practice as well. So again, we may be looking at even more than that 4 out of 5 people declared brain dead who are actually still alive. Or, you know, if we look at other aspects of the brain death diagnosis and how there can be issues, like there's a condition called global ischemic penumbra, or a situation where essentially you can be hiding, or it looks like a person is brain dead due to swelling in the brain that may be cutting off a certain amount of circulation to the brain. And this may be hiding the fact that actually there's still a minimal level of function, which if you reduce the swelling in the brain and allowed some blood flow to come back, or more blood flow, I should say, right, then the person may actually resume consciousness, may actually be able to recover from so-called brain death. And this is not something we speak to in the document, right? Just to clarify, because there are other discussions around those that need to happen, but this is something else that has been documented as a problem, which is distinct from the hypothalamic function issue.
Thank you for clarifying.
With the existing standards, could we say that at least they're consistently applied? And given the discussions, is there reason to think that they might be strengthened?
Good question. I think so. Point number one, are they consistently applied as far as the existing standards go? It's actually been documented again over about the past 10 years that they are not consistently applied. Even if a particular hospital or system is going to adopt something like the American Academy of Neurology guidelines, there's still the issue of how consistently are you applying that in practice. But the fact remains that these are guidelines. They're not a law in and of themselves. So it's not like every single hospital and every single healthcare provider around the country must follow the American Academy of Neurology guidelines. And in fact, there have been a number of surveys done of neurologists over the past 10 years in particular, both in the United States and even worldwide, which have repeatedly confirmed that actually the existing practice is inconsistent. And, you know, a number of neurologists applying these guidelines may be doing less than what those guidelines require. And so, you know, there was a big problem already known of inconsistency in applying the existing guidelines. That was actually part of the impetus for a recent effort to try to change what's called the Uniform Determination of Death Act from 1981, which set out this definition of brain death as irreversible cessation of all function of the entire brain. There was an effort to try to revise that so that it would essentially, let's say, in essence, it would require the following of the American Academy of Neurology guidelines. I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just say the goal was we need more consistency. And in order to get more consistency, if we can adjust the law, which is then adopted by most states in the United States, if we can get this model law to basically require everybody to do the key things of the protocol from the American Academy of Neurology, then that would help it be more consistently applied. Precisely because they recognized it wasn't being consistently applied, right? So this is to your first question. It is not consistently applied in practice. And so, and please remind me, I'm so sorry, I lost, what was the second part of your question?
Well, given the debate, can we expect that those guidelines will be strengthened or improved in some way?
Ah, right. Okay. So yes. So can we reasonably expect them to be improved? I would say no. And our statement says no, not in the short term. Now, we certainly encourage, to be clear, and we call for improvement of the existing criteria for determining death. However, we do not specify which criteria we think would be best, how they would be best improved. Again, this was in the interest of trying to strike a tone of unity. You can get even more division once you start talking about, well, you know, what's the exact way or the best way to improve these criteria that really would establish certainty of death? And there are a number of big questions that remain there. But in any case, we certainly call for, you know, we need to start putting our heads together to try to figure out what are better criteria, or indeed we should say the best criteria to truly determine death. which may or may not ultimately include neurological criteria. That's a question that also remains open. But we certainly call for that improvement. But when it comes to the in practice side of this, again, this is a very practical, pragmatic kind of statement. Okay, they just came out with new guidelines in 2023. So after this effort to revise the Uniform Determination of Death Act that I mentioned, where this particular proposal was put forth that would have essentially enshrined the AAN guidelines as the legal standard, when that was put on hold or sort of indefinitely paused back in the summer of 2023, then right after that, in October 2023, the American Academy of Neurology published updated guidelines on brain death, together with a number of other organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics and others. And when they did this, though, this was effectively tripling down on the position that you don't need evidence of cessation of neuroendocrine function. In other words, continued hypothalamic function and other neuroendocrine function is consistent with what they call whole brain death. But de facto, what they call whole brain death is actually partial brain death, because again, they systematically say it's okay if the hypothalamus is still working. And since this happened, so I say tripling down, why? Because the original American Academy of Neurology guidelines are from 1995. There was an update in 2010, and now we have the 2023 guidelines. So this is, in the original guidelines, that condition of diabetes insipidus I mentioned earlier was considered, the lack of diabetes insipidus was considered compatible with a diagnosis of brain death even back in 95. Now, at the time, I can say, in all fairness, I don't think people imagined that it was as frequent as the data has indicated it to be in the past 10 years, right, back when they first did this. But now we have the data that shows this is a big problem, and it's very frequent that there's a lack of diabetes insipidus and other issues. So the tripling down is that originally it wasn't necessary. In the 2010 update, it still wasn't necessary. And now again, in 2023, they've just doubled down or tripled down, I would say, and said, we still don't need this confirmation of cessation of neuroendocrine function. What does that tell us? Well, let's look at the timeline, right? 95 was the first edition. After the original criteria, go back to 68, by the way. So 1968 to 1995, 1995 to 2010, 2010 to 2023. When do we think the next update to these guidelines is realistically going to happen? And what indication do we have of what the American Academy of Neurology wants? I mean, they just heard all sorts of complaints and concerns about this issue of neuroendocrine function in the discussions around revising the UDDA. And yet they came right out and said, sorry, we don't need it. So this says to us, co-authors of the statement and signatories, they're not interested in improving this, or even, something as simple as saying, oh yeah, let's rule out hypothalamic function. They're not interested in it. They had also a 2019 position paper of the American Academy of Neurology that, again, explicitly said it's our position that you don't need to confirm that the hypothalamus has stopped functioning, that it's okay for the hypothalamus to keep functioning. So yeah, that's my take on it. So it's not realistic to expect, certainly in the next 10 years, that the AAN is going to change its guidelines in such a way as to establish certainty of death, even by something as simple as requiring neuroendocrine cessation of neuroendocrine function.
From guidelines to what an individual might expect. Mario.
Yeah, good question. So,
well, let's have Mario elucidate even the question.
Well, I don't know if a good question, but let me elaborate. Since everyone has a view about the human person and a human body, and when you are explaining, is coming from an association, I assume that association has a view of the human body that is prior to the examination and explanation of that human body. In other words, we are not neutral in our view of what a human body is. So for me, as a quote-unquote philosopher, I may have a view of the human body which is different from perhaps the American Association of Neurologists. So my question is, since they have been changing and they explain the physiological function, non-function, the hypothalamus and all that, my question is there any view, any anthropology, any philosophical anthropology behind this view, whether it's naturalism or whatever the case, which is different from what we may have as a member of the Catholic tradition?
Very good question. And of course, I think obviously the short answer is that there's always some kind of philosophical anthropology behind it, whether the person or association is aware of it or not, or explicitly names it or not.
Right.
And so I would say that it's clear from the approach of the American Academy of Neurology that they do not share a Christian philosophical anthropology, a view of the human person, understanding of the body-soul relationship. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say, and this also comes from some of the surveys they've done themselves about among neurologists about how they understand the criteria. I mean, most neurologists, if you ask them about the criteria and why they think they're okay, would not understand or even agree with the notion of whole brain death. Most of them have some concept that they understand and accept it as partial brain death, basically. And they view it as a functionality issue, like basically if a person's not capable of doing certain things, then that's an okay enough reason to consider them dead. And that actually, for us, from a philosophical standpoint and even from a theological standpoint, equates with a notion of categorizing people who are disabled, have a certain type of disability,
Exactly,
as no longer human, as no longer persons with dignity. And so I would say, again, I don't think that any of them would say this explicitly, but the views that come out when you do the surveys and ask them about brain death issues and so forth essentially reflect this idea that once you descend below a certain level of functionality, you are no longer worthy of or considered to be a living human person anymore, and therefore you are as good as dead. And I think that is fundamentally problematic and inconsistent with our philosophical and theological anthropology. We absolutely, when we look at that body-soul unity, we need to be able to be certain that the soul, the life principle of the person, has in fact left the body in order to consider this person dead. And no mere, list of a cessation of functions, cerebral functions, etc., is likely to satisfy that in and of itself. But then, again, the closer we get here, we do get into some of the nuances about the whole concept of brain death and whether and to what extent it can even be valid. And some of the argument is right in there, because from its origin, the concept of brain death has been tied to a functional assessment of, if you are unarousable unresponsiveness is the first condition, but essentially coma. If you have no reflexes, brainstem areflexia, which originally was just general areflexia, but then they reduced it from the whole central nervous system areflexia to just brainstem areflexia at a certain point. And then the third is apnea. So in other words, a lack of breathing drive. Those are the three essential clinical components of brain death testing. Now, there's much more to it as far as the way it's currently done in clinical practice, but those three fundamental assessors are there. And all of those three things are assessing an absence of something. None of them are testing for the presence of something, like when it used to be the more traditional criteria. You could, of course, see when a person's heartbeat stopped, lack of this would be circulatory criteria, cardiopulmonary criteria. They're no longer breathing and their heartbeat has stopped. But then you would have other indicators in a calmer time frame where there wasn't a rush to intervene to take organs. In a longer time frame, you could see after 20 minutes, you'd have conditions like pallor mortis. You would have, which is, being the corpse being pale, liver mortis, where the blood starts to pool underneath. These are actually not just the absence of something, but now the presence of something that you can detect that wasn't there before. Right, the pallor, the pooling of blood, rigor mortis, of course, is the most famous one most people have heard, right, when the body becomes stiff. These are all new things that happen that we can positively confirm, as opposed to simply saying this person can't do X, Y, or Z. They can't interact with their environment. They can't, react with a reflex, or they can't breathe spontaneously on their own. Those are all lack of functions. But anyway, I don't want to go deeper into the concept, because the idea here with this statement again was just to say, look, whatever you think about that concept, and there are some serious questions we need to resolve there, the actual practice doesn't even do what proponents of brain death say it should do.
Just a few comments. That remind me very vividly a book that I read precisely 1997, 1998. It was a debate between our good friend Ray Dennehy from the American Maritime Association and the Mary Ann Warren, who was the proposal of this idea of precisely the distinction or difference between the person and a human being. And I remember the book was called Memoirs of an Anti-Abortion Militant, or something of that sort, where he sponsored everything of this argument between these two competing anthropologies. And I think that view will have somehow, in some ways, people in the Catholic tradition have not known well, so that we can somehow be aware of that. So it's just a side comment. So
Wonderful.
Valerie?
Yes. So I realize this is, I'm kind of continuing down the road of kind of how somebody views a human person. And I realize it's kind of outside of the scope of the document. So I don't want to go too far down this, but when you say that somebody who approaches a relatively dysfunctional human body, right? Like somebody who approaches that as being, in a sense, already as good as dead, if you will, right? Because they can't function in certain ways. That's kind of a dehumanizing approach to the human person. And I think that's true to a point. What would you say, though, if somebody said, well, actually it's out of compassion, a sense of mercy, that consider it a work of mercy, that if this person is not going to revive to the point of any quality of life, that we think it's a more humanitarian thing to actually let them go, they would maybe suggest that it's an extraordinary care, an extraordinary level of care that's not called for in this situation where there's this hypothalamic function, for example, but everything else indicates that this person is on their way out, and it would be extraordinary. How would you respond to somebody making that statement?
That's actually an excellent question, because it raises the very important distinction between brain death, in essence, as criteria used to assess, to determine or declare death before an organ transplant, versus the question of declining extraordinary means of care. And I would say that while, again, this document's particularly concerned with the fact that people may be killed who are actually still alive, but they're just declared brain dead inappropriately, the document also calls for us to recognize this important distinction, that it can be legitimate to decline certain means of care. So, like, just to set the scenario, I mean, maybe some listeners are not aware of this, but in a brain death scenario, the patient is on a ventilator every time. Okay, so just to make that clear, which means that if the patient's declared brain dead, then the ventilation continues, which essentially the heart is able to continue beating on its own. So it's circulating oxygenated blood around because the ventilator is continuing, respiration's continuing. So the whole body can continue to, in essence, as brain death proponents would say, appears to be alive, as those who oppose brain death would say, is actually still alive, right? But the idea is that's an ideal scenario for removing an organ, a vital organ like a heart or a lung or kidney or anything, because the body and the organ is not being damaged by lack of oxygen. But that vent is still on. Okay, so that is the organ donation situation. Vent continues even after you've been declared dead to keep the organs fresh. However, it could certainly be appropriate apart from an organ donation question. So let's just consider for a moment a patient who's not an organ donor and gets to a point of severe loss of brain function. Now, we'd have to look at the whole clinical picture, obviously, depending on what else is going on there. But it is the case that Catholic teaching allows for the removal of a ventilator or the declining and withdrawal of any means that is considered to be disproportionate, extraordinary burden in terms of its cost and other aspects. Okay, so it's quite feasible that in many cases where a patient ends up in a ventilator situation with severe brain injury, they've been trying to do everything they can reasonably do to improve the patient's condition, etc. And depending on what else is going on, as I say, a decision could be made legitimately to decline the ventilator. Now, I am in no way saying this must happen in every case, or even how frequently it should occur. But what I am saying, and what we do say in our document, is that this can occur, and that this is morally can be acceptable when the benefits and burdens of the treatments have been weighed. And so I'll just add the caveat there as well, since we're talking about it, that it's the question is always around the benefits of the intervention and the burdens of the intervention, not around the burdens of the life of the person. So these, what we call quality of life assessments, are often made where, you know, someone would say, well, this is just a really bad quality of life. If that's the only reason, then that is a problem. But if you're actually looking at, you know, let's say the costs of continued care maybe are disproportionately high to continue, that can also be a valid reason for declining that means at a certain point. So again, I don't want to, you know, commit to any particular decision because these are all case specific, but it is very important to understand as Catholics, we can decline means that have become extraordinary when they don't offer sufficient hope of benefit and they cause an excessive burden. And that is different from the notion of brain death before an organ removal, where you could decline the ventilator, turn off the ventilator in the extraordinary care situation without organ donation, and then the patient would almost certainly die, although there are exceptions to that. Sometimes patients may continue unexpectedly to breathe on their own, etc., once the vent is removed, which actually reminds me that sometimes that's happened in brain death cases before organ transplant, which is, of course, quite horrendous, but that's another matter too.
So if I'm somebody who thinks it seems like a generous gift to donate my organs, perhaps, and I'm thinking I might sign up for that, do I have, you know, is it reasonable for me? Do I have a good reason to expect that if I go ahead and sign up to donate my organs, that I will actually be dead at the time that they harvest my organs?
No. Yeah, I think the short answer is there's really no reasonable expectation that you'll actually be dead at the time of organ removal. And this is what we speak to in Catholics United. Just looking at the statistics, again, 70% of donors are declared dead using brain dead criteria. Of those, if let's say 50 to 85% are actually still alive just based on hypothalamic function, and maybe even more, well, a majority of organ donors just based on hypothalamic function are actually going to still be alive. And this isn't even considering the other 30% of organ donors that are declared dead using the circulatory criteria or cardiac death. And again, this document systematically avoids that whole issue to try to hyper-focus and find a point of unity. But there are some serious questions and issues in that other 30% of donors as to whether you've truly died after a declaration of cardiac death or circulatory death. In fact, one that I can certainly name that is clearly agreed, even again by proponents of brain death, within the realm of what's called DCD, or donation after circulatory death. There's a procedure that's becoming more frequent across the country that's called normothermic regional perfusion with controlled donation after circulatory death. And what does this mean? In essence, it means that they're going to declare you dead by the circulatory criteria. So let's say you're on a ventilator. They're going to turn off the ventilator. They're going to wait until your heart stops. They're going to wait a certain number of minutes, and that could be, it's on average 2 to 3 minutes, but it could be anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes, that they're going to wait after your heart stops beating. And then they're going to declare you dead. And then they're going to block some of the arteries that go from your heart up to your brain to prevent blood flow from going to the brain. And then they're going to use a machine, an ECMO machine, an external machine, to recirculate oxygenated blood in your body, bypassing the heart and blocking flow to the brain. Why are they going to block the blood flow to your brain? Well, because they don't want your brain to resume functioning. Okay, so those who support brain death, and the NCBC, the organization I work for, has for years actually been sounding the alarm bell on this particular procedure, because even if you do accept brain death, it's actually even very clear that this procedure is intended to cause brain death if it didn't happen already. Because it's like you're deliberately going to block off the flow of any blood that could go to the brain as you recirculate oxygenated blood through the rest of the body, in order to keep the organs fresh for an organ procurement. Now, I'm not saying this is that whole 30% this is occurring, but certainly a growing portion of that remaining 30% is going to involve this procedure of normothermic regional perfusion after controlled donation after circulatory death. So there are issues over there, and that's, to not even address the question of, does waiting even a full 5 minutes ensure that this is the irreversible cessation of all function of the entire brain, which is the brain death criteria, and does waiting a full 5 minutes also ensure that your heart has irreversibly stopped, which is the other part of the UDDA, which says that a declaration of death can be made either by the circulatory or the neurological criteria. And the circulatory criteria means the irreversible cessation of the function of the circulatory system. But we have cases where people have certainly been resuscitated by intervention after 5 minutes, right? And there is even documentation of auto-resuscitation in some cases after 5 minutes too, meaning that people spontaneously revive after 5 minutes. And if someone can spontaneously, recommence circulation after a 5 minute period, but we're saying we're going to wait 5 minutes for irreversible cessation of circulatory function, that doesn't sound sufficient, right? So there are some big questions that remain open there as well. Catholics United doesn't speak to them, but that's definitely of interest and concern to anyone, I think.
I feel compelled to mention that my cousin's wife, in her 30s, had a routine surgery on the table. There was some air that, due to a procedure that they didn't follow, got into her bloodstream. Her heart stopped. She was on the table because he wasn't present to make a decision. They were keeping her heart pumping for over 50 minutes. Her heart had stopped for over 50 minutes. And I spent the weekend with them 6 months ago. She cooked, and she's got 2 young kids. And I mean, it was a hard road to recovery, but she's living life and being a mom. And so I just have to mention that example.
Well, yeah. Praise God she survived. My goodness.
Yeah,
wow.
Indeed. Yeah.
Gee, sobering. Now, I want to get personal too, but in a not quite so sobering a way. I still drive.
California.
There's been talk about whether I should still drive. But after a consultation, my wife said she'll let me drive on Sunday. But even Sunday driving requires that I maintain a license. Now, I remember back in the day when I first got my license. Even then, it was dicey. At any rate, I was tempted, and maybe I did. Can I even remember? To mark a little box that said I would be an organ donor.
Right.
Suppose we turn to the youth of today. We do so always with regret, but suppose we turn to the youth of the day and they're wondering about their driver's license and whether or not they should become organ donors. What should we say? I mean, one of my granddaughters is even now on the verge of buying a car.
Wow.
I already told her, go for a tank. Cars. She's had her driver's training lessons. So what about this?
Yes. Well, I mean, Catholics United, our document certainly encourages everyone to not be an organ donor and to remove organ donation status from a driver's license at the DMV in your state if you're already registered. And unfortunately, this can be, apart from removing it from the license, sometimes, depending on the state, it can be a complex process to actually get yourself removed from the registry. Because even if you don't keep the designation on the license, in some places you may still be in the registry because of a past consent that you've given. So that requires a little bit of investigation and effort. And unfortunately, this is one of the things we also call for actually in Catholics United. Like this whole process of being removed from an organ donor registry should be made more clear, simple, and transparent, which it is currently not any of those things. Right. So we think that is a public policy call to action to make this process easy, clear, and something that anyone could do and be sure that they've actually been removed. But at a minimum, if you haven't done it yet, definitely don't sign up. That's one thing to do. I would say also for the DMV question, I mean, there's a real issue. Also, full disclosure, I signed up to be an organ donor back when I was 17 and got my license, right? Because it is a good intention, right? People who want to help others, right? We should emphasize this always, that the intention is a very good one, to want to help others, to save lives. These are very good and noble intentions. The issue is in the practice of how it occurs, and is it being done in a morally sound way? And if that's not the case, then despite the noble intention, then in moral practice, it shouldn't be done. So our recommendation is not to sign up at all. If you have, remove it. And then there's also the question of advanced directives, because, for example, while we acknowledge, again, in the interest of unity, there are certainly going to be people who accept the concept of brain death and are going to work to improve the criteria for brain death so that it will reflect what we call whole brain death, the complete and irreversible cessation of all function. And so we certainly say in the document that if somebody is convinced of better criteria that they think will establish certainty of death, convinced in conscience that this is the case, maybe I'm thinking about neurologists in particular who are Catholic and who are, very convinced of this. And okay, if they want to specify criteria that they want followed, that's something you could do in an advanced directive. Like you could say, I agree to donate my organs on the condition that, these criteria are followed, which I specify. So we do not rule that out, and we say, hey, people do need to follow their conscience. We all have an obligation to follow our conscience, and if those who accept brain death believe that better criteria can work, by all means. But that's not something the average person can do. That's not something that I could even do, right? I'm not a doctor. Like the level of detail you'd have to go or the kinds of testing you'd want to specify, it can get very much into the weeds. And how is the average person going to navigate this? So I think, again, from the pragmatic standpoint, our recommendation is for the average person, just don't sign up. And, don't donate your organs. In an advanced directive, say no to your organ donation clearly and simply, so that there won't be, any ambiguities that could also be potentially exploited by pressures from organ procurement organizations and others who may want to push your loved ones, right? Like if you haven't made a clear decision whether you're an organ donor or not, or if you've put certain caveats in there that aren't entirely clear, that's also an open door to pressures on family to try to agree to make you an organ donor. So there are just a number of other concerns that can arise there, which may be morally acceptable from the standpoint of a conscience, decision at this point, but which we don't recommend as a general rule. We recommend people simply say no for clarity and simplicity. There can be other forms of donation of tissues or bone, for example, where there's no rush to get bone tissue after death, for example, as there is with vital organs like the heart, lungs, etc. So one could also if you wanted to go to that level in an advanced directive document, you could say, well, I don't want to donate these kind of organs, but I'm okay with bone donation or something. Of course, I still recommend doing a deeper dive into the kinds of abuses there may be and moral issues in practice that there may be in these other areas. But at a minimum, again, we say, hey, from the danger of being killed by this process is most real with the vital organs, obviously.
Thank you. Mario.
Well, what do you hope will happen next now that Catholic United has been published?
Yes. So my number one hope is that we will begin to save lives because people will be aware of this issue who have not been aware of this issue. And as part of that, and as a corollary of that, I suppose, my hope is that we will begin to have greater discussion of this issue as we are here today, greater discussion of this issue also among Catholics more broadly in the academic arena, in healthcare, especially Catholic healthcare providers, physicians, professionals, and others, and to really be able to engage with this, I think, in a new way that hasn't been done for decades, literally. So I think that this is one of my big hopes, is that attention can be drawn back to this issue, which in a certain sense has been somewhat dormant or at least pushed to the side for quite some time, given the sort of glaring practical problem that the current criteria, very consciously are only assessing partial brain death and not whole brain death. This seems to me a galvanizing opportunity for us to all come back together as Catholics and say, hey, let's take a really serious look at this again. And on that note, I'll mention, as I alluded to earlier, that the National Catholic Bioethics Center has put out an official statement on brain death just last week on April 11th, which raises the same kinds of concerns that Catholics United raises as far as the recent developments and what has happened. It does a great job, walking through all of those for particularly a more academic and organizational type audience, whereas Catholics United, we're hoping to reach everybody, essentially, including the person in the pew. The NCBC statement is very well done, very measured, but also very clear about the real issues with brain death as it stands today and the potentially serious implications for organ transplantation in general. And I know that we are working on and discussing at the NCBC, trying to put together a symposium, for example, on this issue to maybe, again, get people together at the leadership level and at the practice level to see if we can at least shed light on the issue and hopefully find a path forward that will get some much needed clarity and agreement among Catholics, the sort of thing that hopefully bishops will be able to support and sign on to once they see this happening at a bigger level among institutional players, Catholic academic institutions and healthcare systems and the NCBC and the Catholic Medical Association. If we can all start to get this moving, I think that it will really do much good for the church and for the world and for the protection of vulnerable lives.
Perfect. Thank you.
Now, before Valerie has the next to the last word, I want to have a next to the next last. Well, what should I call it? My fellow panelists know what to call it. We always like to have an embarrassing pop quiz.
Uh-oh.
And we always like to have the pop quiz directed to the kind and thoughtful guest.
Oh, no. I'm in trouble.
Would you like to tell us now about the personal conversations you've had about this nest of incredibly important issues with your own pastor? How did that conversation go?
With my own pastor in my local church, you mean?
Yes. How did that conversation go? So we can use that as a model for the conversation. After almost every show, Mario and Valerie and I, we have a chat with our pastors about how they can best implement
Right.
what we've worked through. So
Yes.
how did that chat work with you?
Well, I'm still working on it.
Yes, that's very good. That's encouraging.
Yes.
In many cases, we're still working on scheduling that chat. All right, now enough of that embarrassing pop quiz. Val, next to the last word to you.
I have a dear friend, one of my best friends in the whole world, who at night, her husband is a neurosurgeon, and she gets to hear him processing his day. And very often, his heart is in tension because of these realities that he's living with as a neurosurgeon, and the pressure around him at times to make these kinds of calls that he's not ready or willing to make. Is there a way that we can, that most of us can advocate for healthcare professionals to be able to conscientiously object? What would you recommend we do to help?
Right, great. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, Catholics United calls for this too, for conscience protections for patients and for healthcare professionals as well, to be able to object, on the grounds that they do not believe that the existing criteria are adequate for determining death, and that from a moral and even potentially religious standpoint, from their conscience conviction. I mean, I have long supported the notion, which I believe is true in Catholic teaching, that our conscience, we are obliged to follow our conscience. We're obliged to form our conscience, and we're obliged to follow it as a matter of Catholic teaching. And so, I would say that there's a place for religious and moral objections for Catholic patients and healthcare professionals in an area such as this, where they believe that life is on the line and that they're being asked to do something which they believe may be contributing to the killing of a disabled, innocent person. I think that is something we can call for. So in a practical way, how could I put this? Okay, every state has laws about determination of death. And they usually we have federal legislation and we have state legislation regarding healthcare professionals and conscientious objection. So we should be looking for opportunities to promote and support any legislation that will strengthen conscientious objection opportunities for healthcare providers at that state level and at that federal level. And we should also be looking to the extent that this is feasible, although I think this is going to be a bigger picture issue, changing the state laws on determination of death so that if they do not already include it, they will include exemptions for religious and moral objections. Now they're due, like for example, the state of New Jersey is one famous example. While almost every state in the United States has adopted that UDDA model legislation about circulatory and neurological criteria, New Jersey does have a specific religious exemption for brain death, essentially. And this is actually why many people may be familiar with the case of Jahai McMath, the young girl back in 2013 who was declared brain dead in California, and then ultimately ended up being taken to New Jersey, where she lived for another 4 years. And clearly was not brain dead, despite the attestations of multiple physicians, even in the court in California. And they were able to do that because of the religious exemption or objection to brain death. So if we can, that's a practical item that can easily be understood and encouraged and supported by anyone. Hey, let's get religious and moral objections to determination of death by neurological criteria into our state law. And in any case, let's strengthen those general conscientious objection legal opportunities for healthcare professionals who think that they're in conscience, they believe they're being asked to do something immoral.
Thank you. As always, the last word, the first word, the gospel, and we end with the gospel for today. Jesus said to the crowds, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger, and whoever believes in me will never thirst. But I told you that although you have seen me, you do not believe. Everything that the Father gives me will come to me, and I will not reject anyone who comes to me, because I came down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of the one who sent me. And this is the will of the one who sent me, that I should not lose anything of what he gave me, but that I should raise it on the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have eternal life, and I shall raise him on the last day. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.